Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bianca Vasquez-Tonis, a reporter for the Great Divide team at the Boston Globe. There are a lot of you who signed up to be here this morning. And that tells me that many folks want to connect around the uncertainty of this moment. With so much at stake, there's also disagreement about how to move forward and go back to school. We see from a Suffolk University poll released this morning from WGBH, the Boston Globe, Mass Live, and State House News that Massachusetts residents also are deeply divided about whether schools can open safely this fall for in-person learning. I'm sure we'll talk about that with our excellent panel. Before I introduce them, let me take a moment to take care of housekeeping. All attendees are muted and your video is off. We'll open up the floor to audience questions around 10:40. Please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen to pose a question. I'll read your questions. Please let us know if you want the question directed to a certain panelist or the group. And this virtual event will be recorded and distributed afterwards. So, moving on to our panel. We have Neliana Lebron, an incoming senior at the Margarita Muniz Academy in Boston. David Venter, a parent of an incoming junior at the Green Academy in Boston. His son has autism, and Venter has been a relentless advocate for students with special needs. Jose Valenzuela teaches social studies at Boston Latin Academy. He also runs an after-school program that combines mentoring and wrestling. David Fleischman is superintendent of Newton Public Schools. And Sarah Dryden Peterson is associate professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where she studied education under extreme circumstances in combat zones. And she looks at the connections between education and community. So first, I'd like each of you, starting with Neliana, to speak for a minute or two about what you need to feel safe going back to school this fall. And remember that we're thinking of safety in the broadest possible terms. Neliana.
Hi. So what I need for school is like social distancing and students to understand that Corona is still happening and that hopefully we can all like do it together, work together, continue to wear masks and just to social distancing, like I said before, and yeah.
Okay, how about David Venter?
Hi, everybody. Well, David Venter, I'm the father of a teenager going into the 11th grade at BGA, hopefully. First, I'm really concerned about how he's even going to get to school. Number one, whether the school buses are going to be outfitted properly. I think the MBTA is going to add another complexity that's going to be outside of school control. The main thing that I'm concerned about is my son has an IEP, which I'm sure a lot of kids have too, and he's in an inclusion setting, which means collaboration is extremely important in his learning development. That's really key. But I might add that collaboration or collaborative environment is part of the most important model of education in general. So with COVID, this is going to make it very difficult. And with the PPE requirements, I believe the lack of being able to see facial expressions and all the other things that go with social interactions with peers and even teachers need to be able to understand whether or not a child fully understands the lesson. And a lot of that is through social cues. I believe that that's seriously impaired. And I don't think that a teenager or kids are going to be wearing face masks all day. I'm sure everybody knows this. They're hard to breathe in, they're uncomfortable. But kids may have some asthmatics, be asthmatic. I think that people are forgetful, including me. And I'm really concerned about how these guidelines will be enforced. And I don't believe they should be enforced by disciplinary action. I think there's going to be more, there has to be more in how we're going to make sure all this works. I would say as a parent, I don't want to get calls from school and I don't want to attend hearings. So I'm hoping that this will be able to be, I guess, worked out by all. But I just don't believe it can be enforced by disciplinary action.
Jose?
Yeah, hi, good morning. I'd agree with everything said so far by Neliani and David, one of whom is a student in our district and one is a parent in our district. We were part of I think what I'm concerned about is basically, it's just more of a question. Our school's going to be adequately funded to restart with all the safety precautions in place. It's going to require funding. It's going to require that support. Only just last year, the Boston Teachers Union negotiated a new contract that demanded a full-time nurse in every school. So that was only a recent requirement, and not every building that didn't have a full-time nurse before might even have all of those necessary precautions in place, whether it's the equipment or the actual physical spaces. If students are, they have a fever or they have some of the symptoms, they need to be put in isolation before they're picked up to go home from school. And some schools don't even have a space for a nurse already. And so we're basically saying we need double the space for nurses that they have now. And again, this was only a recent a development for Boston Public Schools to have a full-time nurse. And so now that that's in place, I'd like to see the funding also in place to make sure that those nurses are given everything they need to do exactly the job that they are set out to do, which is make sure that the school buildings are safe for our students and for our teachers, many of whom might already come to the building with compromised health.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. I see David Fleischman is with us. David, what do you need for safety, to feel safe?
Yeah, so Bianca, I'm not going to repeat. I want to talk about the social and emotional and anxiety. And I think that showed up in your Globe poll, Bianca, as well, is that we have students who are going to come back anxious, we have staff, and we have families. How to deal with that is going to be incredibly challenging. We know that if there's a lot of anxiety, students can't learn, and it's really hard for teachers to teach, and it's hard for families to send their kids to school. The challenge I think we face as district leaders is we always need to be reassuring, and at the same time we have to be transparent about what reality is, and that's what people want. And striking that balance is very, very difficult because we want to have as many people as possible back to school. But that means we have to address the anxiety, which is so real and so fundamental. And that's why I'm glad we're having a conversation we are today. I think we're going to have a lot more of these as we get closer to September, because that's collectively a real challenge and very, very important.
Yeah, Sarah, what do you think about this question as someone who's looked at, education under duress?
Yeah, well, it's just great to be part of this conversation today with all of you. And like you were saying, Bianca, this work in conflict settings where education is massively disrupted and uncertainty prevails, it's been striking for me to see some of the similarities in the situations we find ourselves in today. And one of the shifts that we see in conflict settings that I see taking place right now also is this shift as the real long-term nature of disruption sinks in from making decisions that are solely on the basis of what's life-saving to thinking about what's life-sustaining, what makes it worthwhile to be alive. And learning, we find, is almost always at the top of the list of what's life-sustaining for children and families in conflict settings. So I think the question that we begin to ask ourselves about schools shift. What risks are we willing to take in terms of health for what benefits? And I think this question really begs a set of other questions, many of which have been raised already this morning, and particularly not only whether it's worth it to return to in-person school, but what kind of learning actually makes it worthwhile. So this is really a question that is weighing on me. I worry that we'll spend so much time thinking about the logistics that we won't focus on some of these other critical dimensions of what is worth it, what learning goes on once teachers and children are in these newly imagined learning spaces.
It's an excellent question. I fear that an hour is not enough to do justice to all of these things. So one question that I have is how much, this is a big state and it's a diverse state, and in many ways, as far as the resources that districts have and the, the geography of the places where people live. And I'm wondering how much consistency would you like to see across schools and districts? How much, we know that there's likely to be some differences based on how prevalent the virus is. We know that there'll be, there are different access to internet around the state. But should districts with higher percentages of low-income students reopen differently than ones with wealthier populations? And how might our notion of what's safe vary depending on the demographics of the district and community? I'm hoping that maybe Jose and David Fleischman might talk about this.
Sure. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So as far as the consistency question and coordination, I think that would be great. I think there are teachers who have children in other districts and that might help with childcare. So I think on that point, it would be really nice to have, that kind of coordination, among districts, and obviously leadership from the state, from DESE would be really important in making sure that reopening schools happens consistently. I think as far as the other question about making schools safe based on the type of district, whether it's a wealthy suburban district or an urban district with, serving a much lower income population. I think I really agree with actually what Sarah said as far as kind of how we're thinking about schools serving students in the myriad ways that they do it, right? Holistic learning, that requires, it requires more funding, not less. And that the state has already balked at providing the promised funding that's, was based on the new education formula signed into law last year. That was really, had widespread support among lots of districts across the state. And they're looking at, just using the old formula for this upcoming school year because of potential loss in tax revenue. And I think that would be really, obviously that's really problematic, and I would find it actually really detrimental because some of the things that will be cut if state funding isn't, fully realized for these districts are things that really support kids. So libraries and librarians, recently a Boston public school, the Mather School, had to, could only come up with $15,000 to support that librarian's position. And she stepped away. She couldn't accept such a low income, such a low salary. So they're going to go without a librarian next year. And that's really, I think, harmful for the student population there that won't have a librarian. In my first teaching position, I worked at a school with no cafeteria, no gym, no library, and no auditorium. And I think I always ask folks, like, after that, what is left? Why are we still calling that a school? And so I think in terms of just sort of like holistically, what schools do to support students and make them feel safe in the broadest possible sense, right? That's going to require probably not the same level of funding that we've received in the past, but actually more funding to make, and that just a final point I'd probably make is I think there's just been a narrative as well that wealthier suburban districts have been doing more during this crisis. And I actually don't feel that's true. I feel like urban districts, I feel like Boston Public Schools really went above and beyond to provide for students during this crisis. And I think teachers that went above and beyond. And I could list so many examples that would take up the entire webinar. But I think that sort of narrative has been harmful. And I think it's sort of encoded in this question that what needs to be done differently is that wealthier districts are here and so, urban districts are here. And I think that only comes down to sort of like the base funding that those schools are able to provide for their school, for their students. And I don't actually think that's true in terms of like the actual delivery of what happened during COVID and what we can maybe hopefully expect during any reopening.
it's certainly true that all districts have been challenged incredibly by this crisis. David Fleischman, what do you think?
Sure. I think consistency, Bianca, is, from the state level, is really, really important. I also, at the same time, districts are going to need some flexibility based on local conditions. But I think we start with a standard that let's try to get everybody back if we can, based on public health guidance. And then within that, and Sarah was alluding to this, what should school look like? And I think we will need different approaches. When I look at the poll this morning, I think there are parents that may keep their kids at home. And then, so how do we work collectively, maybe across the state, to offer some kind of instruction if some teachers are in school? I think balancing the academic with the social and emotional. What I also worry about in consistency is that I worry, I've read some places where we may only have kids, will only have 1 or 2 classes a day. If you're a high school student that loves art or loves music, how do we keep that going and balance that with the public health guidance? And that's where actually very prescriptive guidance is very helpful, because the fear is the growing inequities during this crisis. And I couldn't agree more that Boston teachers and urban teachers are working as hard or harder. And I speak as somebody who's worked in suburban and urban districts. And the social and emotional needs of kids are so huge that we have to consistently focus on that across the board. We can't focus on math problems on day one, because this is going to continue to be crisis teaching. So I think we need some local flexibility with a lot of state consistency and support. Some of it, financial at the same time. We do have a $6 billion state budget gap, which is truly tragic, as Jose was saying, particularly for the 35 communities who are going to benefit most. But I do think consistency right now, and superintendents don't always say that, but I think consistency right now, because everybody's watching every other district, because it's so public right now, because you can see what districts are doing.
How much choice should parents be given in terms of how much online versus in-person instruction they want? That's a question for Sarah and David Venter. David, your sound is off. Okay.
Should I go first as a parent?
Great, go ahead, David. Yeah.
So first of all, I love this conversation, and I just want to circle back to being a parent in real time. I'm very concerned about this. First of all, my son has done better online than in class, but that's COVID. We know that requirements have been sort of pushed back a little bit, and we know that the kids aren't necessarily getting the full lesson. So if there is a surge, or there is going to be, week a, week off, you hear all kinds of rumors of what's going on. First and foremost, Zoom is not a learning platform. It's a meeting platform that corporations developed in order to meet remotely. And so the technology that's in place right now, I'm very concerned about. So when we talk about technology, we need to define what technology is needed so that kids can collaborate, so that teachers can mimic a whiteboard. There are technologies out there that will help students to be able to learn in the same style or similar style that's being taught in class. So, and I also will tell you is that with distance learning, if that's the case, whether you go in class or whether you have to be at home, maybe you have symptoms and you have to be quarantined, I'm just really concerned about the quality of education. And I just don't believe that the technology in place now has not been properly researched, because there are other technologies that are out there that could be better. So, and it's just not working. And if you have brothers and sisters that are home with you, if you have a dog, my dog, great, he's not barking right now. There are too many distractions. So we have to figure that out. So to answer your question, Bianca, I don't think currently technology is working in general.
What I hear you saying is perhaps you would want more distance learning if you felt like it was better.
If it was better. I'm concerned about the quality of education for the kids and whether or not we're going to have a whole generation of kids that are going to be behind because of what happened with COVID. They still have to move forward.
Yeah. Sarah, what do you think?
Sure. I think just picking up on this question of choice and flexibility that I think both David Venter and David Fleischman have raised of really what are the purposes? And it seems to me that choice can be a double-edged sword in many ways, as both David and David are pointing to. We know that choice can lead to greater student engagement, and choice between these types of modalities, online, face-to-face, might be a really important way to differentiate some instruction for students based on how children learn differently, and also these kinds of constellations of health factors that lead to online or in-person being able to meet the needs. But we also know that choice can really masquerade as choices that are not really choices and can exacerbate the kinds of inequalities that already exist. So I think some important questions in thinking about this question of modality and choice as a policy question will really be what the purpose of the choices are. So who's able to access what choice, who can access the internet and a computer for online learning, whose families can support learning at home, who can safely get to school, all questions that we've raised in our different roles today. And I think another big question, Jose, that I think you were really pointing to is about the allocation of resources to create top quality teaching and learning in multiple modalities. So thinking about providing a choice and what that means in terms of our decision about using the immense collective resource that is teachers' time. And I guess just one final thought on this too. It seems likely that over the course of this next year, students will have some combination of online and in-person learning. We don't know what that looks like, but I think a challenge to all of us is to ask this broader question about what kinds of learning can be strongest online and what kinds of learning can be strongest in person, and be able to really plan for ways that allow us to be adaptable and prioritize those kinds of teaching and learning when we are in each of those modalities in a purposeful way, even if it is a kind of crisis teaching of anticipating both of these eventualities and thinking about the kinds of teaching and learning that can be best suited for each moment that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Or also which communities, are better suited in person, and which communities at least are more capable of online learning as well.
Which may come back to the question, David, that you were pointing to of this, what kinds of consistent decisions or even centralized offerings might be possible so that students across communities, depending on what the health needs are, depending on what the access issues are, might be able to better access a shared group of resources rather than concentrating resources within districts, which we know is inherently unequal.
What, David?
Can I just add something to that?
Sure.
Because I think that what everyone is saying is absolutely correct. But as a parent, we're talking about 2 months until September. Okay? I need a lot to happen before September without going through a whole bunch of policy decisions. My son has 2 more years in school. So my question is how he is going to be safe going back to school, and whether or not he can recover from the gap in learning that he's already had, and whether or not the quality of education is going to be just as good as what it was before. And I just need to make sure that happens now as a parent.
Are you saying that you want more certainty right now? You
Yes.
want more information right now? Maybe that's a good time to ask a question that Sarah had brought up, which is, what happens to us when we don't know the answers to these most important questions? David, you've talked a lot about, being confronting, lots of rumors in the community about what's going to happen. I'd also be curious about what Neliana thinks of this. What happens to us when we don't know the answers? And for good reason. I mean, this is a fast evolving problem. But I'd be interested, and I think people should hear from Neliana and David about, how David Venter, about how this is affecting you, and also Sarah.
Is Ileana there, or?
Neliana's here.
Yeah. Hi. Hi. It's kind of like a hard thing to think about. Can I have a few seconds to think about it, please?
Of course.
Okay.
Sarah, do you have thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I think just like Neliana, these are the kinds of questions that we all need time to think about. And when we don't have answers, it becomes this kind of scary and disconcerting situation, and we're really looking for answers. And I think this comes back to one of my biggest concerns, is that we look for the easier questions to ask and the easy answers, rather than asking some of the hard ones. And I hope that because we don't know the answers, and we will continue to ask questions that are really hard, that we can learn to be more nimble and adaptable, and in some ways really embrace the idea that we are likely to shift course many times, and that that's not going to be a mistake, but in fact is appropriate and needed, because we're all learning to be more adaptable to the kinds of contexts. And of course, this is a leadership challenge, but I think it's also really about trust and relationships and community, that while we're learning, or what we're learning is how to keep both individuals and communities healthy. And what we know about that is changing all the time. So the right answers to the questions today could be the wrong answers tomorrow, and that we need to be open to continuing to ask the questions we don't know the answer to, and trying to figure out how we can best work with what we know now, being clear about what we don't know, and being explicit about why we might change what we think. Again, not because it was a mistake, but because we were doing the best with what we knew at a particular time, but with this utter commitment to exactly what you're talking about, David, which is high quality learning for each child, that's the benchmark question to be asking as we ask and answer these really hard questions.
Bianca, could I respond to one of David's points that I just thought about? And this is a great pressure on leaders all over, which is the uncertainty that Sarah was talking about. People look to authority figures and leaders for uncertainty often. And we are in these uncertain times, and that has added to great frustration. If you were to ask school committee members and superintendents and principals in certain districts about the angry emails they've gotten, why aren't you doing this? And, David, I appreciate your question about, can the district provide for my son this coming year what was previously offered in person? And at some point, it's really hard to say no, or we're not sure, because it's I don't know how many times I've said it's not possible to replicate in-person learning with distance learning. It's going to be really different. At the same time, Sarah used the term nimble. Districts need to be more nimble, and I don't think districts will ever be the same. We've learned so many lessons from this. And that is the positive, that we will be better off in the long run because of this crisis. We'll be more flexible and more nimble. In the short term, there are certain services and programs that are very hard to replicate in person, or online that are in person, which is why I hope we're in person as much as possible. And that's our great challenge. So I want to provide a hopeful message. I think some of our students are going to be more independent and more resilient. One of my colleagues said, we hope this will be the greatest generation, because that did happen once in our country. So I do want to add some positive thinking to some of this as well.
Can I add to, I just want to say a little thing, is that, first of all, what I hear every day, I also own a bakery, and a lot of teachers and students come into the bakery to purchase some things. Just this morning, I was at Dunkin' Donuts, and there was a parent there who heard that I was going to be on this panel, and she wanted to share some of her concerns because she's part of the rumor mill that she doesn't know what she's going to do because she heard that they were going to do 1 week off, 1 week on. I had someone else just today say, oh, I heard they're going to be repeating the university model, and I don't think that that's going to work for my child. What I'm saying is that every single day I hear rumors. I know that my son is asking me all these questions 3 times yesterday. Am I going to play football? Are we going back? What's going to happen with school sports? While I think that we're in an era or we're in a place of unknowing, the lack of communication from the districts has added to the anxiety. As a matter of fact, just for me as a parent, I found out most of the information that I got was from Bianca because I'm on the panel. And so I found myself trying to ease other people's anxiety because the communication is just null and void. And like you said at the beginning of the meeting, that we need to do more of these meetings and involve the parents, and so that they can calm their children down, because everybody is anxious at this point. And I also think, and I really hate, and I've said this before, sending in 4 to 8 paragraph email doesn't work. Nobody's reading them. All right. So we also have to look at the communication practices and processes of how to make sure the parents are on board and they have the information that they need so that they can pass on to their children, and whether or not they can even work or childcare. I mean, this is crazy. I'm sorry to have to use that term, but the communication has been none.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see that there have been, I'm glad we got into this because there's some questions from outside, specifically about transparency from districts. So you brought up, David, your son's love of football and basketball, and we know that schools provide a lot more than just, reading and math. So I was hoping that Neliana, if you're up for this, and Jose as an after school provider, and David, that you might talk about, how districts can keep this up. I mean, how and should districts keep providing opportunities that keep students engaged and keep them engaged with things they really love?
So I play softball, and so I was kind of like really, because I was like show up to practice because it was like the beginning of the season before Corona started, and like for me personally that kind of hurt in a way, because like softball is like a thing that like my dad like brought me into like doing, and so like I hope that hopefully we can play sports and do after school activities, and like different clubs can continue to go on, but at the same time, it's like, how do we manage students? Like, how do we manage how to keep students safe, and how do they manage how to like keep them together, but like not together in a way? I don't know how to explain it, but I think sports should go on, but like it should be, well, I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of a hard topic to talk about, and because it's like very hard to think about it, because like since like I don't know, sorry, I'm just like it's like so confusing for me because I'm on the kind of like they should go on side, or like the safety thing, so it's like trying to keep up with it is like really hard to like think about at the moment. But yeah,
Jose, could you talk about what you're thinking?
Yeah, sure. So I think based on the question, it's obvious that how essential like athletics and music and art can be to a school environment and to the well-being of kids. So I know I sound like a broken record, but this stuff needs to be funded and probably funded at a higher level than it's already been. So the athletic budget of Boston Public Schools is only $4 million, right? That's less than 0.3% of the total budget that's allocated to something that, I think you called non-academic, but I think is definitely essential to a school. I think it's fair to say not all sports are coming back. Boston Youth Wrestling, which is the organization that I lead, our sport is probably the last to come back. We're a full contact sport. It's obvious for anyone who's watched wrestling to know that social distancing is impossible. And I think, safety would be our top priority. We want to make sure kids are safe. And so probably until there's a vaccine, I think it would be safe to assume that wrestling doesn't come back until then. But we've pivoted in a lot of ways our programming. So we have been a meal distribution site since March, giving out free meals for families and students in Boston and the Roxbury area in particular. We're doing that through the summer, and we'll probably continue that through the year. We've been really fortunate to receive funding from the Boston Resiliency Fund from the city of Boston to fund more of that. So we basically converted our office into a meal distribution site. So we needed some funding to actually do that, to buy the equipment. We hired kids this summer to work in our coaches and training program. So we're doing that all virtually now. So our kids are learning to be wrestling coaches and doing that virtually and receiving mentorship support. And we're going to be basically transitioning that model to the school year. So our kids will be kind of part of doing mentorship and leadership and virtual workouts for kids across the district that can participate. In some ways, sort of like, as pointed out, I think earlier by Sarah, about sort of like how we can pool resources effectively. This actually lets us reach more kids in some ways than we could have before, because we don't have to physically be in one single space. We can kind of be virtual. And so, there are lots of ways in which, even though we can't be physically in spaces with kids, that we can still do do the job of our mission, which is to support, youth development and to provide mentorship and leadership to kids across the district through our sport, but now through this other sort of like medium. So I think, maybe being creative about how we do that. I know lots of coaches in other sports have maintained contact with their kids. And so even if, I just definitely advocate not cutting that kind of funding, because even if those actual sports can't come back in their full way, there are still probably ways in which the relationships that students built with their coaches can still be maintained in a way that helps them support them academically and mentally and all the other ways that athletics and other extracurriculars do already.
Bianca, I'm going to give a quick answer. I thought a lot about your question, and I'm going to give an example what high schools are going to have to grapple with in the fall. Number one, we're not going to hear about sports and whether it will be sports till mid-July. The state's going to wait. They're going to provide clear guidance on that. But high schools are going to have to make decisions about how much students move in a building. And that is going to be a critical question, because the state guidance might be, when feasible, keep groups of students together. Well, if we keep a lot of students together, how do we have art and music and all of the electives that are important? So that goes back to the risk reward. If we keep high school students together in one pod, first of all, it can lead to terrible tracking, but then we lose what's special about high school sometimes is electives in special areas. So that's where at the local school level, they're going to have to make real decisions about what's best for kids. And those are going to be critical decisions and not easy ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
David Venter.
Yeah. First and foremost, I know a lot of students are very concerned about this. A lot of students believe that they were going to get a sports scholarship or something, to go into college. I know that, me personally, I'm extremely concerned about this issue. We have an obesity epidemic in the United States, and just having kids sit in a class all day or sitting behind a computer with no exercise is very concerning to me. And I also believe that activities as such are really enrichment activities that really make school fun, and you're really finding out who you are as an individual and what special talents that you have that you can give to the world. I'm an artist because of enrichment activity, and that I've taken that through my entire career, and it was because of Mrs. Pearl in the first grade. But secondly, which is really important, a busy child stays out of trouble. Okay? We have a lot of social stuff that's going on, whether it's dibbling, dabbling in drugs, unwanted pregnancies. I believe that the spreading of COVID could, at home could be possibly, kids going into unsupervised activities. I mean, in school, it's different because, especially for a high school student, because we're putting all these guidelines and procedures in place. But, my son is going to go to the store. Okay. What happens along the way to the store when I'm not home and I'm at work? There's so many things that could happen. And just today, they're talking about the firework phenomenon. And they said that part of the problem is that kids are bored. They're not busy. So they're lighting off fireworks and burning down buildings and cars. So
yeah.
As a parent, I understand the non-funding. I understand all of this. Right now, going into September, I need to keep my son busy.
Yeah. Yeah. Along the same lines, we've heard a lot of concern out there about mental health of children. We've also heard concerns about mental health of parents right now, for that matter. What should districts be thinking about in terms of safeguarding students' mental health? And how can that be done effectively from a distance? Niliana, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that they should continue to do counseling, but like how in stores they have that border thing, a clear border, and if they it'll feel like a little prison thing, but it's a safer idea because a student can continue to talk to their counselor, but in a safer way. And teachers should be able to call students and check on them if they're okay after school. Well, my dad brought up a point about if students need to bring up their credit after school, that it'll be harder, but it should be a main point because students that are struggling, because there's especially being a senior, it's a harder year, and so they should continue to do counseling, but in a safer, better way, either on phone, Zoom, because there's different platforms that they can use, or even if they do decide to do in school, in-person school, they should decide to put the border thing up, so at least a student can be able to talk to a counselor, and if they're stressed, if they feel everything is overwhelming, and they should keep up with just a whole class and how everybody's feeling, just make sure they have breaks, not too much homework, and yeah. That's what
So when we think about low-income students, are there other safety issues that have arisen from schools being closed that you don't think people are talking about enough? I'd be interested in hearing from Sarah and Jose on this.
I can start, Jose, and then you can come in. And actually, one of the things that you said before, Jose, has really made me think about this too, this idea that out of crisis often comes the opportunity to reimagine and remake. So 6 months ago, it sounds like you never would have imagined the ways in which you've been able to recreate the team that you have. And sometimes it comes out of immediate necessity, but also out of this kind of opening to see more clearly what's working and what's not, and how we might work together. And Neliana, you said this right at the beginning of our conversation, that core to all of this is doing it together to fill some of these kinds of needs. And one of the issues that I think that we're not talking about as much as I wish we would in terms of inequities is this kind of interconnectedness of our lives that I think has become even more visible in the face of the pandemic, this kind of real life learning about how each of our actions influences every other action, as well as the vastly unequal ways in which we experience the pandemic. And I think it's an opportunity to really think about bold and new ways of what we owe to each other and how we allocate resources. And maybe also to be really consciously reframing questions, not only about how do I keep my child safe, which is clearly a priority, but how does helping to keep all children safe actually make my children safer as well? And so allocating resources to make sure that all children have the opportunity to be healthy and safe. Our kind of individual choices might more closely mirror collective choices, because my children are healthier, safer, and learning more when those around them are also healthier, safer, and learning more. So maybe we can kind of seize this opportunity to think about how we allocate our time, our energy, our money, not only to these narrow bubbles, which often are the districts or even the schools or even the classrooms in which our kids are located, but to this broader collective, because it's clear we all depend on each other in order to do it together, Neliana, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Go ahead, Jose.
Oh yeah, sorry. So I liked that Sarah talked about kind of reimagining, and I think one thing that's probably not being talked about enough in this setting, but it's definitely being talked about a lot in our world, is actually not returning to normal. That returning to normal actually assumes that things were going well for everybody prior to school closures. COVID-19 did not create conditions of inequality and racism in our country, and definitely in our districts. These issues have always been there: deteriorating buildings, lack of funding. Those are things that have been exposed. In terms of how people are feeling COVID-19 in the state of Massachusetts, we can see that people of color are facing it at a disproportionate rate. Again, that's not something that COVID-19 caused or created. It was always there. And I think in terms of things that I would like to see happen, right, is that, we need to address racism when we come back from schools. It needs to be a major priority. And I think part of addressing it is also embedded in the language of a lot of the ways in which we've focused on school closure so far, which is the achievement gap. The achievement gap is racist. The achievement gap it only identifies the distance between wealthy districts and districts serving low-income students as a sort of like a baseline, but it's another way to describe students in sort of racist ways. Dr. Kendi, who is going to be leading up the Anti-Racism Institute at Boston University, he was on a webinar last week, and this is something he's addressed in his own writing. And I think, if people are interested in finding out more, they certainly don't have to hear it from me. But I think just overall, I think urban school districts have been addressing this, and it's something that I'd like to see, statewide as an initiative. And just two more things, just really quick. Are schools actually really safe and welcoming for all kids? Who are they safe and welcoming for? And as far as, before school closures, how do we make it better than before? And I just also add that, there's another issue that I think has gone unaddressed so far in this conversation. I'm not saying it's been unaddressed in other conversations about just this huge drop that DCF has seen in what are known as 51A referrals, so reports of child abuse and neglect. And that's something that's really concerning because, teachers and educators and just schools in general, often just on the front lines of, identifying, child abuse and neglect. And if we're not able to be in person, being able to find out and report on this and keep kids safe is something that is deeply concerning to me too.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to bring up a couple of questions from panel or from participants, our audience, that go deeper into some of the things you two have been talking about, Jose and Sarah. One question is it time to end school funding based on local property taxes and move to state funding where Dorchester and Dover get the same resources?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure. David Fleischman looks interested too.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Absolutely. That would be wonderful. I mean, unfortunately, we have these boundary lines in states that indicate what school districts are. And there was a 1974 Supreme Court decision that makes that really hard to change. But absolutely. I mean, I think the loss of the Student Opportunity Act funding for the 35 districts in Massachusetts, I mean, that's a real tragedy in this. So I think school funding is a big part of that. Obviously, school segregation is a big problem too, and that doesn't address that. I think they both have to be addressed together, you know, segregation and the funding. But obviously, school segregation is related to redlining, and you know, in Kendi's book, he obviously gets into a lot of that. But I think that's really important. I think our legislature had a step with the Student Opportunity Act, but there's obviously other sectors, housing, healthcare. You know, we all know what they are, but yes, and hopefully there's a real movement among.
We can't hear you.
I think there's a real opportunity right now with the energy and all the people who are at the rallies. Could they support, you know, something like more funding? Could they support housing? I think, how do we take advantage of the opportunity right now where people are really aware of the race, you know, the racist structures in our society?
David Venter, you look.
Yeah, I think, and I know that we haven't addressed this, but at some point we're going to have to address it. I understand that defining need is based on economics. Let me just say what I say. It really bothers me to live in Boston and for folks to constantly use the term low income.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that term is going to, it just, as a parent, as an African American, having a multiracial son, you know, I have a yard. You know, does constantly being defined low income means that we deserve less or we receive less? Maybe it does. But that definition has got to change. On my street in Roxbury in general, they've just built, you know, 19 houses which I don't like because it's gentrification, pricing out everybody here. But, you know, they're selling for $800,000. Those kids will probably go to school here. I think that constantly referring to us as low income, and especially in this environment, I think it kind of says race and less than, and I'm bothered by it. And especially when, give you just a quick example of it, and I'm kind of being guarded because I'm emotional about this topic, and I really apologize for that. But like, for instance, when I keep hearing on the radio or reports about technology and how kids don't have a Chromebook, that's not true. BPS has done an amazing job with making sure all the kids have the technology as needed. And as a matter of fact, in some of the suburban communities I know, they're behind from BPS. But should we be talking about, okay, connectivity is not just whether or not a kid has a modem. That's not true, because Xfinity and all these other people have given free access to internet. Should we be talking about, if you live in an apartment building, brick and cement can interfere with connectivity? Mm-hmm. But you could live in a very nice apartment building. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I just think that, you know, I'm really bothered by that. And I think that language has to change.
Mm.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so I completely agree with David. And I think part of what's harmful about that language is the way in which, you know, our assessment system punishes school districts, you know, that are serving kids, you know, like we serve in Boston. And, you know, the metrics they use, you know, I'd like to see different metrics. You know, there was a report by the Globe, I think, Bianca, you actually wrote it, about Milton Public Schools, you know, not necessarily having enough anti-racism in their curriculums and needing to do more, and comparing that to the McCormick Middle School in Dorchester that has been doing anti-racism for years. Yet they've been threatened with state closure and takeover because of, you know, failing test scores. And I'd definitely like to see a pause, if not a permanent stop, on MCAS testing and statewide assessments, because the way they're used are often to punish school districts that actually need more funding and more resources, not less. And I agree with David that I think the language does sort of have connotations about who students are, what they have, what they're capable of, which I don't think is true. And I think if we use different metrics, we might see that districts that are wealthier skate by because their scores are very high, but underlying it are other issues that are either ignored or they're just, they're not given the full attention by the state or by those districts themselves because, there's no mechanism to sort of like force the hand, so to speak. So I definitely agree. I think the language has to change.
So we are coming to the end of our session. And to bring it back to the issue of opening, I just wanted to get a quick sense from all of you about whether, you're more concerned that schools will reopen too quickly or too slowly. Anyone want to jump in? I mean, you can even just say one word.
Maybe I can jump in here, kind of reflecting on the conversation we just had too. That is this, I guess I'm really concerned that we'll see schools reopening, the possibility of schools reopening with a set of clear rules for health, but not focusing on the real purposes of teaching and learning, how we're reimagining curriculum, how we're not taking a return to the status quo as at all acceptable, how we ensure that relationship building is core to learning, and enabling young people across every school to understand and act on systemic racism and inequalities that, of course, are not new, as we've been talking about, but exacerbated and really unconscionable to ignore as we think about what these purposes of teaching and learning are. So I hope that we can really focus not only on the kind of the boxes that we need to figure out to make sure everyone stays healthy in a narrow sense, but also these big, expansive kinds of questions that allow us not to be trapped within those boxes.
And I can add to, as a parent, to answer your question, Bianca, is like, whether it's the school or at home, I just want a quality education for my son, period, end of story.
Naliana, what do you think?
Oops, sorry, my phone almost dropped. I think, like, my dad was just listening to you guys talking right now, and yeah, so he was just wondering how they would prepare the teachers, how to like prepare the teachers better. Like, remember how I said, well, I mean, the other day I was mentioning about how if like they keep clean of how they keep the, I don't know how to say it, how they keep clean of like the classroom, how they like help students with like hand sanitizers and like certain things like that. And yeah, just like keeping the classrooms clean, keeping everyone clean, keeping everyone safe, keeping everyone like apart, and just like helping each student and like understanding what is actually going on and like what is kind of like coronavirus itself, and like reassuring like what's still like reassuring each student like that this is still going on, but if we do go back into school, that like I just said, reassuring what's still going on and how like we should approach it and ask, and we should hear from like each student. Like we should have like more student voices on how they could approach like this type of situation. But yeah.
Anyone else have thoughts? We're running over time now, but.
Bianca, I mean, just to build on what Sarah was saying, I think increasingly there's going to be so much panic about PPE equipment and how much we have with the shortages, and schools are going to be panicked about that. And my fear is we spend so much time on the tactical areas like that we lose sight of we all need healing, and we've all been through trauma. And how do we support the emotional needs of not only the students, but also our staff? I mean, our staff has been through a lot of trauma. So when I've talked, how do we heal our staff so they can support our students? To me, that's huge. And then we can focus on the broader issues that we've been talking about, like systemic racism and healing. But we have to get through all of it, and it's a lot, and we can't lose.
Okay. Well, we're going to end it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this and being open to exploring some messy issues that, none of us really have answers to. Thanks again, and I hope everyone will join us for future town halls.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.